Hello everyone, welcome to the class examination. This is me going back over my previous class examinations and doing them much more in depth in a multi-part series for each class, and we're going to start with Commando now that we're done with the Paladin. Now this particular episode is going to focus on the improv slash new players slash just skill combinations that are really effective for the Commando, and this is going to lay the groundwork for future builds that we're going to be talking about in later episodes in this series, as well as giving you a base idea of some rough builds you can kind of improvise your way through until you at least get to endgame, where you're going to start unlocking the sets that you'll be equipped with for the rest of your days. So with that being said, let's talk Commando skills. Now, there is one skill that I almost invariably build on almost all my Commando classes, to be completely honest, my Commando run-throughs, and that is Flame Touched plus Temper. There's a couple of reasons why I really love these two particular skills. First off, Flame Touched increases the fire and lightning damage. Obviously, that goes without saying. Even if you're playing heavy on the soldier's side, you can go into Cadence and you can go right into Discord here, turn that physical damage into elemental damage off of Cadence, and suddenly your temper is your Flame Touched is increasing that portion of the elemental damage, the fire and lightning portion of elemental, which is really impressive. So even if you're using Cadence, you can still do an elemental build. Second off, this really frees you up to either use Cadence if you want, or you can go into Fire Strike, which is usually where I go with Commandos, even if I'm doing a physical heavy build, because Fire Strike not only gives you physical damage increases, especially at this point where you get, extra physical damage here, but you can also pull in some extra crystal modifications if you're using any two-handed weapon or a single-hand melee. You can get any of these benefits here, right? But at the very least, these two really do quite well, and the reason why, I actually never explained the full reason why, if you're doing a physical build, splashing in that bit of fire damage can really help you out in a lot of situations, or maybe a more physically resistant enemy isn't really as resistant to the fire damage that you're bringing to bear here. Now, this is only if I'm using specifically an auto attack build. And while there are builds that I will use Cadence over, it really depends on what equipment I'm using, my usual go-to is Fire Strike, and I will usually grab Markovian's Advantage if I'm going with an auto attack build. Now, there's several advantages to Markovian's Advantage, pardon the pun, that aren't present with Zul'Han's Technique. You'll notice Zul'Han's Technique provides you with extra internal trauma damage and is better with melee weapons. That doesn't really matter. The key thing here, though, is Markovian's Advantage, that plus X% to all damage. This is both the physical and the fire damage out of Fire Strike, which can be really quite potent, especially if you're running a two-handed weapon of some kind and you're running Searing Might, or even if you're running Searing Strike. That's a total of, I think, 15%? Yeah, 15% as well, which is absolutely delightful. You're just doing absolutely tons of damage with this. Again, I'll build Zul'Han's Technique if I'm running a melee weapon, but not always. And I definitely don't usually... Well, I've built this once or twice with ranged weapons, but it's really not something I'm fond of with ranged weapons, because if I'm doing ranged weapons, I'm looking a bit more for piercing damage anyways. But I'll usually run, for auto attack builds, Markovian's Advantage, Fire Strike, and Explosive Strike. Now, if I'm using melee very specifically, Vindictive Flame and Ulzwin's Wrath are absolutely huge. It's burning enemies around you all the time. You're getting plus extra % total speed, which includes your attack speed, which means your Fire Strike / Cadence is triggering more often. And you also get a certain amount of healing off of Ulzwin's Wrath when you get that. And it's reducing enemies' damage around you each time it does that, which is really nice when you're a melee character, right? So if you're going melee and you're using even a auto attack build, Vindictive Flame is a really powerful ability at your disposal. Now, whether or not you go into Decorated Soldier or Olorun's Rage really depends on if you really want to focus on that physical damage. If you do, these are both great. If you don't, I would recommend skipping over them, right? Just a personal recommendation. I do usually build military conditioning regardless of what the situation is, because extra health is never a bad thing, and the physique increase can really help you equip stronger armor without you needing to necessarily invest as many attribute points, which can really help you in the late game. when you're trying to increase your equipment. There are some equipment with really high amounts of physique requirements, especially if you're using a ranged weapon where you're going to want to put a certain amount of your attributes into cunning, attribute points into cunning. You're not going to want to invest as heavily attribute point wise into physique, so military conditioning can really help you with that. Just as an aside, even if you're using a melee, this is very helpful. If you're using a two-handed weapon, I'll talk about shields in a bit. Menhir's Will is also really great. I tend to build this less often if I'm ranged. I'll usually build it when I'm ranged, but not always. It's not a requirement for ranged ADS builds. ADS? For some reason I was thinking about... Anyways, for auto attack builds, this is almost a requirement if you're melee. A little less so if you're ranged, but still very useful. If you're playing hardcore veterancy and Scars of Battle, also are really nice. They can even be nice in regular, especially Scars of Battle if you're playing solo. I find this a little bit less useful in multiplayer because I'm not always going to be the one stunned or frozen. A little bit less useful there. Obviously, just a brief aside, Field Command generally I only use in multiplayer situations with Commando. There are no pets. You don't really encounter allies often enough to merit this, and while the boosts that it does offer are nice, I very rarely build this in single-player situations because there are better things that I can build as a Commando, in my opinion. But, be that as it may, also keep in mind that we've got Counter-Strike with really nice retaliation damage. Again, this is more in line with melee, but you'll also notice, hey look, fire retaliation. Retaliation damage, extra retaliation damage added to attack. Hey there, get that retaliation damage in there, you're boosting Ulzwin's Wrath, you're getting extra retaliation damage from Temper, you're getting retaliation damage from Counter-Strike. In fact, auto-attacking melee, single-hand or two-handed, it doesn't matter, is one of my favorite ways to approach this, because you can really run military conditioning, Counter-Strike, Markovian's Advantage, Fire Strike plus Explosive Strike, either one of these, Flame Touch to Temper, and just absolutely go wild with Vindictive Flame and Ulzwin's Wrath. Sometimes I'll build Blast Shield because it does offer fire retaliation when you're almost half health, so there is that. But not always. It really depends on how I feel, but it's just absolutely a fantastic time, especially if you get retaliation damage from your devotions, which I'll talk about in a future episode of this series. But it's really quite lovely. You can go into Fighting Spirit if you really want to. I don't like this as much because it is fairly inconsistent for me. I'm either cursed or just unlucky or whatever. If I am going melee, I'll usually go two-handed just so I can grab Menhir's Will. Typically, not always, but a lot of the time, right? If I'm using a single hand, I'll use a shield and I'll go into Menhir's Bulwark, right? And still use, obviously, Menhir's Will. But you do have that option of always having Menhir's Bulwark. If you don't want to do a physical, damage-focused build, I would recommend Menhir's Bulwark, especially if you're not using a single hand with an offhand. I think I've built like twice offhand using build, but most of the time it's either a single hand weapon and a shield, even with pistols, and I'll talk about that in a second, or two-handed weapons of some kind. Because even with two-handed guns, Menhir's Bulwark can be quite potent. Again, we're talking about the retaliation damage, but usually my favorite way of auto-attacking is with a melee weapon. Now let's talk about single-hand pistols and shields. First off, I don't usually necessarily build Vindictive Flame with range. Sometimes I will. I have a character right now that does, actually, but not always. Still looking at that Markovian's Advantage, but if you're using a single-hand pistol and a shield, you've got a very interesting option in Force Wave. Now, why is Force Wave so interesting? There are a couple of very specific reasons. First off, Force Wave is a really effective ranged stun, right? You've got a good 10-meter range on this, and I think this gets boosted? Yeah, this gets boosted at Rending Force, so that's 12 meters there, right? And then there are, of course, if you're really interested in doing so, you can find equipment that boosts that range even further. But regardless, it's a really impressively ranged stun. Straight line. This is fantastic for anybody shooting people, because then you can stun the enemy with Force Wave and just blast away. Or what I actually prefer to do, instead of using an auto-attacking build with a pistol, I'll run Force Wave, these of course, Decorated Soldier, run these, run these two, right? Not necessarily stun jacks. I'll talk about that in a hot minute, but I will usually run canister bomb and Granado, and there are a couple of reasons for this. You also don't necessarily need Menhir's Bulwark. You can go with Ulrin's Rage as well. It really depends. Let's just go with Ulrin's Rage for kicks here. But if you're using a pistol and a shield, pistols don't hit that hard. Individual pistols don't hit that hard. Let's be really honest. If you're using a single-hand pistol, you can go with the classic auto-attacking build, but you don't have access to either the Searing Might or the Searing Strike, which can really mitigate your ability to use these. Now, you could, of course, go into Cadence. Cadence doesn't care at all. You even can pierce through enemies with Fighting Form. But with a ranged pistol, you can really go gung-ho with Force Wave to stun them from a distance, and then you go into Canister Bomb, right? Get some nice pierce damage there. You're already increasing your pierce damage right here with Temper. You're increasing your pierce damage with Ulrin's Rage if you go into that. You've got good old Granado, which can knock down enemies, which really helps. Right? You're going all the way up to 100%. What is this, level 7? 8. At level 8, you have a 100% chance of knocking down enemies, right? Damage here, retaliation damage added to attack. I don't necessarily go into Skyfire Granado. Honestly, you increase physical damage so much more on Commando that it's rarely worth it. Same exact thing with Concussive Bomb. Now, you might want to build Concussive Bomb for the chance to stun. Honestly, it's such a low chance and such a weak stun that I very rarely find this important. Even with a pistol ranged with shield, Force Wave is a consistent ranged stun of a substantially longer duration. So I, again, very rarely build this. But the fact remains that you can absolutely shell enemies out here with this. Now keep in mind, we can actually get a little bit crazy here. If you really wanted to, you could go into Ulswin's Chosen, increase the damage of these two, really go gung-ho out here. We can go really heavy on the damage, right? Drop Menhir's Will for a second. Drop even military conditioning if we really want to. We can absolutely just decimate with this. I don't necessarily often go into internal trauma, but I will at the very least go into Rending Force. And again, you don't necessarily have to do all of this or even any of this. I very rarely go into Ulswin's Chosen because it is a whole bunch of points just for one skill. And I don't usually use stun jacks with ranged because these do a lot better in melee range because all these stun jacks are hitting the enemy rather than them spreading out and doing little tiny pieces of damage to individual enemies. I don't use these that often with ranged. Sometimes I do. Don't get me wrong. But it's not as often. But you can absolutely go wild over here with these. Go into this. With the shield. Go and, put the last points into military conditioning if you really want to. You can have an absolute field day. And you can just absolutely. Now keep in mind. I want you to know this. Notice this. 2.8 second skill recharge here. 4.5 second skill recharge. 3 second skill recharge. Right? Force Wave. Granado. Force Wave. Canister Bomb. Force Wave. Granado. This sounds like, there's no way you'll have the time for that, but keep in mind also you can get equipment that reduces those skill cooldowns a little bit more. But you can just rinse and repeat that system if you really want to. Again, you could go with the build that I mentioned earlier, the auto-attacking build, using Fire Strike or Cadence. If you're using a pistol, Cadence is probably better because at Fighting Form it's just a lot more effective. Personal opinion. But you can absolutely just recycle, rinse, and repeat all of these, no problemo. Just keep on, stun, knockback, stun, canister bomb. You can just absolutely chain these together in a really beautiful and horrifically ugly way for the enemy. I don't know why I'm pulling that out. But you do have that option as well. And that's, again, something I typically do with single-hand pistols, but not all the time. Sometimes I'll go with the auto-attack. It really depends on what build I'm going for. But you do have that option, and it is a lot of fun. Now, this is going to seem ironic, but those are the two more exciting ways I've played Commando. Does that mean Commando is boring? No. Commando is straightforward, and it's a great class if you're new to the game, or if you just want something you really can just get a rhythm going with, because there's not really any surprises here. Now, there are a couple of other things that I want to mention in the class really quickly before we kind of finish the video up. Again, I want to point out the fact that Canister Bomb and Granado are consistently effective with pretty much any build, because whether you're going elemental or physical, these will be boosted. Okay, I want you to understand that Granado only does physical damage at this first stage, but once you get to high impact, you're now doing fire, physical, and internal trauma. Still primarily and predominantly physical, but a little bit of elemental damage is never a bad thing. And even if you're only building, if you're going with a physical specific one, like you're going into Olorin's Rage, you're going into Decorated Soldier, you're really going out there, physical damage heavy, Granado is still great. You know, a little bit of fire damage isn't going to kill you. It's a good thing for a physical build, right? And it allows you to, whether or not you're melee or ranged, the Granado at high enough levels, obviously, I think it was level 8, if I remember correctly. Yeah, 8. At level 8, you're able to knock most enemies back and clear space around yourself. Now, larger enemies, bosses, heroes, etc., they're not going to be knocked back most of the time. That's fine. You're able to clear the smalls away from you, which is particularly helpful for ranged characters. Get some breathing room and just focus on that one-on-one with whoever you're fighting. So in pretty much every build of Commando, I've at least considered Granado. There are some skills that I don't necessarily consider. For example, I passionately hate Flashbang. If I'm ranged, I don't always consider Stun Jacks a viable option. It really depends. Granado has always been something that I stop and ask myself, do I want Granado? The answer is usually yes. Granado in Commando is something you will always appreciate having, in all honesty. Just like Flame Touched and Temper, this is really consistently great. Do I build it every time? No, not like these two. I think the number of times I've not built Flame Touched and Temper on a Commando, I can count on one hand. They're just that incredibly useful for any build that you can care to construct for Commando. But I'll usually build Granado, because again, it's usually useful. It's usually a great time. Again, whether you go with Fire Strike or whether you go with Cadence really depends primarily on how far along you want to go with Fire Strike. I rarely go past here. I don't usually go into Static Strike. Or if you want to go into Cadence, and Cadence is for the physical heavy builds, right? Or for ranged. I typically prefer it. If I want to mix in some elemental here, and I usually do for purposes of surviving against anything physical resistant, I'll usually run Fire Strike and Explosive Strike. Right? So there is that as well. Furthermore, if you're looking for a stun in your melee, frankly, Stun Jacks is probably going to do you more good. Again, we're splashing in a little bit of elemental damage to mix things up a little bit, make sure you're not, you know, going up against something that's physically resistant. That would be quite disastrous. Full Spread itself has very impressive physical and internal trauma damage amounts as well, but that I tend to use this in melee more than Force Wave a lot of the time, just because it is better at melee. If I'm using a two-handed melee weapon, I'll run Force Wave, because the amount of boosted damage it gets from just the two-handed weapon on Force Wave is huge. Consider the amount of weapon damage we get at the final level, which is 220%. This assumes it's not being boosted by any equipment. So with a two-handed melee weapon, Force Wave is better, but in a single-hand melee situation, because Stun Jacks isn't pulling any weapon damage, the fact that your smaller single-hand weapon does less damage per hit doesn't matter to Stun Jacks. So Stun Jacks is actually the better choice for single-hand melee weapons. I just slugged my mic, I apologize. So do keep that in mind when approaching, what stun should I use, Professor? Well, it depends. What's your melee weapon? If you're ranged, again, I don't tend to use Stun Jacks. If I'm ranged and using a pistol, I'll run a shield, use Force Wave. If I'm running a two-handed ranged, then I'll build Stun Jacks and pray. It's a bit luck-based in that instance, but that's only if I really feel like the stun, and even then, again, I don't often go in that direction. So just something to keep in mind there. So other things, I don't know what I was choking on air for, I apologize. Other things that are fairly significant to mention, Blade Arc, if you're using a melee weapon, is worth considering especially if you're running elemental. That bleeding damage is something that's not heavily resisted by a lot of elemental resistant enemies, so it's always worth considering if you're running a melee elemental build. Now, if you're running a melee elemental build, this is just to keep in mind, cadence is better. If you're running a elemental heavy build, like up until now I've been talking about hybrid physical elemental, right? But if you really want to double down on that elemental damage, cadence is better for all weapons because you can convert all that physical damage to elemental damage, and your backup damage type is going to be the bleeding and the pierce from fighting form, right? Pretty big deal. So even with a full elemental build, you're running full elemental. Let's just go with full elemental, right? We're going to run all of this with a two-handed gun, okay? Glorious. Pull this back, because ironically, if we're going with the full elemental build, you don't really want those. We're going ranged, so yeah, we're just going to run temper here, ironically. Pull this all the way back. Run that. Actually, we still want Menhir's Bulwark. What am I doing? Get over there. There we go. And there's still points to spare with a two-handed ranged ability. You can use, if you really want to, and this is something I'm actually fond of doing with two-handed range. I mentioned earlier that I don't often build a stun with two-handed ranged. The primary reason for this is because Warcry, it says taunt target. Forget about it. Terrify. Break morale. Now, break morale is primarily useful for disrupting enemy skills. Whether or not that matters that much to you really depends on how tanky you're feeling. For example, with what I've got here with Menhir's Will, with Menhir's Bulwark, I actually wouldn't realistically build Break Morale here. But I still would go into Warcry, and I still would go into Terrify. Even a 33% chance to terrify targets is a good enough chance that some of the enemies around you are going to be terrified and hit the road. The rest of them, you blast, right? Now, this works even with a shield and a range. This works with melee as well, but this is usually what I'll fall back on instead of a stun. It's less consistent, I will give you that. And technically it is melee, but it's got a much better radius than technically stun jacks, which spread out in front of you and do very little meaningful anything. That's a 33% reduction to the enemy's health, and that is reduced enemy damage, and when you bust out Terrify, that is a percent chance to terrify. 1/3 of your enemies are going to be terrified, statistically speaking. But you can absolutely go wild with this, and it's a very elemental intense build. Obviously. And again, you're using the internal trauma, not the internal trauma damage, the pierce and the bleed from cadence to counteract elemental resistant enemies. Again, it's very important for you to have at least 2 damage types, and in this particular case, if you're using a two-handed ranged weapon, you're doing elemental, pierce, and some bleed off of fighting form. Now, this is actually also the reason why I recommend cadence when using ranged. Fighting form is really great bleed damage. If you go all the way to deadly momentum, that's even more bleed. For melee, Blade Arc is a little bit better, in my personal opinion. With melee, whether you're two-handed or single-handed, you can grab Searing Might and Searing Strike, so Fire Strike is a better option for melee, and you have Blade Arc that you can fall back on for the bleed. And here we have physical, extra bleed, internal trauma. You could go into Clean Sweep. I'm rather fond of Clean Sweep, personally, if I'm using a single-hand weapon. Notice, again, that the weapon damage percent goes down, so it actually is only pulling 35%, or roughly a third of your weapon damage. So if you're using a single-hand melee, grab Clean Sweep. Yes, it gives you a recharge. That's a small sacrifice to pay for increased knockdown and overall more damage, because your total damage is being increased by more than your weapon damage percentage is going down, right? So if you're using that single-hand melee, Blade Arc, clean sweep. Grab some delicious bleeding damage in there to help you, regardless of whether you're... Now, I've been harping a bit on bleeding damage. There's a specific reason why. Commando, if you don't build bleeding damage, and some people will disagree with me on this, but it does bear out to some extent, ethereal heroes and bosses have really good physical resistance and really good elemental resistance in almost every circumstance. If you see a star or a skull and they're ethereal, if you don't have bleeding damage by the late game, you're probably in trouble. Because, again, a lot of ethereal heroes and bosses have strong physical and strong elemental resistances. It's just how ethereals work. It's just how bosses and heroes work. It's a very dangerous combination for Commando. And in fact, if you delay long enough in building some form of bleeding, your mid-game could be a bit painful. Now, a lot of people are going to immediately come at me with, hey, devotions. Yes, absolutely. Let's talk about devotions. The very nice thing about Commando, even with these potential handicaps, and I'm not going to spend too much time on devotion here, but it is important to know that you have very easy, great access to a lot of fantastic ways of reducing the enemy's resistance to your elements. Now, physical resistance down is very easy to access. A point here in yellow, you put a couple of points into Assassin's Blade. You technically only need 4. I'm just completing it because OCD. But here we have the Glorious Assassin's Mark, which is an impressive 32 physical and pierce resistance down. Again, pierce resistance, bit better for guns, but don't worry about it. If you want that melee, go for the melee. It's a beautiful thing. Secondly, and a lot of people sleep on this, Viper. I recommend this every time. If you're doing elemental damage, grab the Viper, please. 20% reduced target elemental resistance for 3 seconds is nothing to sneeze at. This also sets you up very beautifully for a very easy transition into Ultos Shepherd of Storms, King of Elemental Resistance down, 20% reduced target elemental resistance for 3 seconds. Yes. Yes. Now, also notice, and this is pretty key, Hand of Ultos is 100% trigger on critical attack. Oh, look. Plus 133 offensive ability for Flame Touched. Offensive ability, the higher that is, the more often you crit. Yes, indeed. This is another reason why Flame Touched is amazing on Commando, and you should, if you're not building Flame Touched, that's fine, but understand that you'll have a hard time getting the crits Hand of Ultos really wants, right? Just be aware. It's also, by the way, the same thing for the Assassin's Mark. 100% chance on critical attack. Flame Touched really helps. Temper is a really beautiful thing. I cannot emphasize that enough. Now, whether or not you go into the Unknown Soldier or Hand of Ultos is entirely up to you. You can theoretically swing both, because the interesting thing here is that the hammer, regardless of whether you're going elemental or physical, it's very easy to splash in internal trauma damage. Right, so let's just pretend the Unknown Soldier. This is the Pierce and Physical, right? No, this is the Pierce and Bleeding. Alright, so we're probably going to lean a little bit more towards Azraka then, because she's Pierce and Physical. So we'll just lean on that one a little bit. So we go into the Hammer. If you're not using a shield, we're going to assume you're not necessarily using a shield, so we're going to pass over Anvil. We're going to go into the Owl here. I swore I wasn't going to do too much devotions, but here we are. Ah, well, no regrets. We'll grab... You know what? Actually, we can grab the Bull, which does internal trauma damage, which is a really fun time. Now, we can also go into the Stag, Physical Bleeding. Again, I recommend some bleeding with some physical retaliation there, right? Not physical retaliation, but retaliation, physical bleeding. We can drop the yellow here. We have the 6 yellow for this. Oh, look, we have Azraka. Isn't that fantastic? We'll temporarily ignore that, because that's just attack and cast to speed. It is nice, don't get me wrong, but it's not necessary. And now you'll notice we have 9 blue already here. Oh, look, we have 10 blue. Now we just need our red and green. Now, where you want to get your red from is entirely up to you. Whether you want to get it from the Mantis, whether you want to get it from the Vulture, maybe the Ghoul. totally up to you. The ghoul is almost a requirement if you're using cadence or fire strike. Keep in mind, because you've got that increased attack speed. It is incredibly potent. This is an automatic activation when you're under half health. It's a glorious time. All right, just as an aside, that's just magical, right? So we'll throw in the ghoul here just as an example. If you're not using the ghoul, then probably the mantis or even the vulture would be a little bit better for you. We'll use the ghoul again for convenience sake. We'll put a single point in green so we can grab our spoder here, and we can grab the Scholar's Light specifically, pull out this green. Ultos, we don't need that necessarily. Go ahead and grab Hand of Ultos, and look at that. You've got Izraka, you've got Ultos, and you've got 5 points to spare. Now, how you want to use those points is entirely up to you. Maybe you want to finish these 2 constellations, maybe you want to finish a completely different constellation, that's entirely up to you. Maybe you want to go into the Quill. Totally up to you. Maybe you want to go into the Anvil. You can do that. Now, you could go into the Quill instead of the Owl and then go into something else. For example, the Falcon, right? There's some possibilities there. Totally up to you. This is just kind of a sampling of devotions you can run. But it's very easy to get Azraka for physical and pierce damage increases. And also get into Ultos for the elemental damage, the elemental enemy resistance down, the Danger Noodle for more elemental resistances down. It's a piece of cake. And you still have 5 points to spare. And you can easily do elemental and physical, and even get a little bit of bleed in there. Again, you could go into the Falcon for physical and bleed. You could go into the Fox for more bleed. You have options. You could go into the Quill for more elemental. You could go into Tsunami for specifically cold and lightning because you don't have enough cold damage in your life. I don't know. It's totally up to you. You could go into the Dryad for extra healing if you want. How you approach this, there's a bunch of different things you can do here to get to the end goal of these 2, but I just wanted to prove how easy it is to get both Azraka and Ultos. Alright? It would be almost as easy getting into the Unknown Soldier. Almost. There's a couple of adjustments, but we're not really concerned about that right now because Azraka is overall better for Commando. But it's very easy to do a physical elemental combination with the Commando, and that can really help you. Again, bleeding damage is very important if you're taking on very specifically ethereal heroes and bosses. If you're not anticipating a lot of those, you can skip on the bleeding. But at least when you're leveling up to level 100, you're going through the campaign, you're completing those campaign missions, you get to Malmoth, grab the bleeding at least temporarily. It'll really help you out. No, you're not increasing it by a massive amount, but just a little amount of bleeding. That stacks. Every time you blast someone with fighting form, that's 50 bleeding damage over 2 seconds, even at level 1. Every single time that you're just refreshing that. Same thing with clean sweep. Right? It's just useful. Now, that's primarily where these are primarily where I approach the Commando. The Commando, like I said, is a very straightforward, really well-coordinated class. You've probably realized by now, but there's very few ways you can... I won't say mess up a Commando, because that's not really... You can't really technically mess up any build. You just gotta readjust it. But a lot of the skills of Commando, a lot of skills of the Soldier and the Demolitionist really flow well together, as I'm hoping I've proved to you today. Again, the only real exception to this, technically speaking, is Field Command, which, again, I only use in group settings when I'm playing a Commando in multiplayer. That's about it. Other than that, these all work really well. I do tend to avoid Brimstone. I tend to avoid Blackwater Cocktail. You still can use these, but again, there's not really much bonus for chaos damage. Now, you could, if you really wanted to, go into the Soil's Witchfire, get that fire resistance down, get that chaos resistance down. I don't often do that. I've done that once or twice, and it was okay, but I never felt like it was more powerful than anything else that I could work, and frankly, I think it was a little bit weaker, because now you're looking at chaos damage, and, you know, compared to the bleeding damage, it's just a mess. It's just a mess. but I don't usually go for those. I also don't usually necessarily go for Hellfire Mine either. Again, in a multiplayer setting, it's a little bit of a different story because my allies can probably use the Aether and Chaos Resistance down. But other than that, I very rarely max out the Demolitionist in this particular context. Mortar Trap is impressive. It also benefits in a similar way from Granado and Canister Bomb, but busting out the points all the way to the end zone just for the big one, which is really where the Mortar Trap gets really impressive, is often not worth it. I'd rather stop here and run either a full Canister Bomb or more likely a full Granado, because it's just a bit more useful overall. Again, keep in mind that the Mortar Trap has a chance to stun, which is not really quite as nice as the guaranteed knockback. Since most enemies that are immune to knockback are generally resistant, or if not outright immune to stun as well, so especially since this isn't even a guaranteed stun, it's only a 33% chance, this doesn't knock back people despite being called a big one. It's just honestly not as useful as often as Granado is in the similar circumstances, right? And frankly, Granado, as you can see, is a full 3/4 of the recharge time. It's 3 seconds here, it's 4.5 seconds here. I just really prefer Granado. Any situation that the Mortar Trap is effective in, the Granado is just as effective, if not more effective in, is basically how that goes down. But other than those kind of caveats, most of the skills here are incredibly useful and work really well together. Even if you're going with a really physical heavy build, you're really going hard on that physical and internal trauma, you're running Decorated Soldier, you're running Ulrin's Rage, Stun Jacks still help. You can still get a lot of benefit out of Flame Touched and Temper. Canister Bomb still helps. Granado still helps. And you can splash a little bit of elemental damage against those enemies that are resistant physical. As long as you have just a little bit of bleeding, and again, it's very easy to incorporate. You're using Cadence, alright, gut up to fighting form. You're using a melee weapon, and you use Fire Strike, throw in Blade Arc. Bleeding damage, you know, it's very whatever. And even if you don't want to use the bleeding damage, if you're really dedicated to the elemental physical or one or the other, it's very easy to splash in all the resistance drops you need. Especially elemental, because you've got the Danger Noodle and Ultos working at that. But you've got plenty of physical and Pierce resistance decreases here, right? And you have very easy access again. With 5 points, you could very easily grab Slayer's Witchfire. With 5 points, you could well, okay, not very easily, but you could get up to the Widow. You would have to make some small adjustments, which is fine. Maybe you drop the Ghoul, you go into the Vulture, maybe. I don't know. Maybe you drop the Owl, you go into the Quill. Whatever you want to run with. It really depends on how you want to approach it. Doesn't make a big difference. You can get to the Widow and reduce that lightning resistance if you really want to. I typically, if I'm going to reduce any additional resistances past the elemental, I will do Slayer's Witchfire, because you actually do have at least some access to chaos damage. You have zero access to anything Aether damage, so very rarely will I run Arcane Bomb. I think I've only done this once or twice. Slayer's Witchfire, the Eldritch Fire here is a little bit more useful for that, because you do have, if you really wanted to, Brimstone, you do have Agonizing Flame and Demon Fire, if you want to. Like I said, I very rarely do. But it's there if you want it. So, with that being said, if you liked this, please like and subscribe. If you didn't, please ignore me. If you have any comments, questions, concerns, ideas, suggestions, or requests, please leave them down in the comment section below. Next, I will be talking about the sets available to the Commando, the endgame sets available to the Commando, and talking about those. And then we'll talk about the individual items, and then we'll talk about builds. But, yeah, with that being said, thank you very much for joining me, and have a great 24 hours.